What's going on, guys? This Earth build in Wo Long Fallen Dynasty is one of the craziest builds that I have used yet. This build does insane damage and lets you actually take advantage of 2 phases fully for the price of 1. This build is super OP, does a ton of damage, and is great against boss fights. It allows you to use heavy armor like it's light armor and move around with insane agility while you're dishing out punishing damage using both the earth and metal virtues. I'm going to go over gear and skilling first, and then I'll go into how this build works and how you can do insane damage with it. Guys, before I get into this, scroll down right now and click that subscribe button. I've been putting out a ton of Wo Long content and it really helps me out. That being said, stick around for the entire thing so you know everything you need to know about this build and can have a blast playing it. So as far as equipment goes, there's a ton of armor sets in the game and it's confusing kind of which ones to use. You can see my stats here with my attack power, my proportion, equipment weight limit, making me super light on my feet while using heavy armor, which is really important for endgame, as well as my earth and metal stats below. This build does a ton of damage, is super tanky with the defense of 583 and physical resistance of 20%. That being said, getting into the gear first. So I am currently using the Sir Magnificent Beard set. That set can be obtained by maxing out Guan Yu as a sworn brother and receiving his Sir Magnificent set with the Azure Dragon Crescent Glaive. The skills for this build involve maximizing Earth Virtue, which affects your equipment weight limit, making you super light on your feet and being able to dodge at a high agility rating while wearing heavy armor, which is important for endgame, and the amount of spirit that you gain when deflecting attacks, which is perfect for this build. Additionally, you want to have 40 points in metal virtue, so that way you get abilities from metal virtue. You also get enhanced spirit sustainability and wizardry spell benefits for consuming spirit at a much lower rate. You can see I'm at 71.5% here, meaning I can cast a lot more actual spells. This is great because we're going to combo both of these virtues together because it only increases our damage output here, and I'll show you exactly why. So the reason this build is so good and lets you take advantage of 2 full virtues very easily is because both of these weapons, your main weapon is going to be the Azure Dragon Crescent Glaive, which scales primarily off of earth, and then secondary off of metal. Your secondary weapon is the Quake Griffin Hammer, which again scales off of earth and secondary metal, meaning by investing a lot of points in both stats, because of the ratings for the weapons, you actually end up doing the same amount of damage overall, whether you put 100 points in earth and 0 in metal, or vice versa, or split them down the middle 50-50. The only real difference is when you split them down the middle in a way and put 40 in metal virtue, that gives you obviously access to the higher level skills for metal virtue. So the main weapon being the Azure Dragon Crescent Glaive, this is going to be your primary weapon for dealing spirit damage to enemies. You can see we have spirit damage dealt in perfect condition bonuses here, as well as spirit sustainability and stone attack power to bump our attack power up. The secondary weapon is going to be the Quake Griffin Hammer. This is also going to be our big hitter, so we can switch to this weapon to do big hits and huge damage against bosses. We also have stone attack power, spirit damage, and toxin attack power on this weapon as well. I went ahead and also put these similar stats on both my ranged weapons as well. For my gear, I'm using the Sir Magnificent Beard set. This set bonus is used with our primary weapon as well, meaning we have all 5 pieces, giving us spirit gain from deflecting, martial arts consumption reduction, a damage reduction upon deflecting a critical blow from enemies, meaning we'll take less damage after that, and the biggest part, which is glaive damage plus 8%, meaning our primary weapon is going to do an extra 8% damage on top of all the buffs we already have. On every piece of gear, I've basically put damage dealt percentage as a special effect, meaning we get 2% just about per piece of gear, totaling to 8%, toxin attack power, stone attack power for our abilities, and poison accumulation on enemies. So those are the special effects I have on most all of my gear, except on some gear pieces I swapped out heaviness accumulation on enemies because we're using both heavy and poison accumulation on this build. As far as accessories, I just have on damage dealt bonuses. So damage dealt bonuses on both, increasing our overall damage again for this build. You can see my equipment weight here, meaning I am a high agility rating right now, even though I have on fully heavy armor because I have so many points in earth, making this build that much better because the heavy armor is needed for later game content, and you have the agility of having light armor. You get the best of both worlds, and you get the best of 2 different phases with this build, which is what makes it so insane. Now again, you can see my stats here. Both weapons have similar damage and overall a lot of damage. So again, whether you put points in all one category or split them between both, you end up doing the same amount of damage with both weapons. The one thing is, once you have a good enough agility rating, I would recommend also continuing to put points in the metal virtue just so we can continue to buff our damage on our toxin abilities, because they are really important abilities for this build. As far as spells, there's one in particular that I've been swapping back and forth, but most of these are pretty consistent. So I've been using Illusionary Shell as a defensive ability. Since this is an earth and tanky but extremely high damage build, this skill is extremely good. So for a certain period of time, it actually creates an invisible shield around you and absorbs a certain amount of damage. So it doesn't fully negate an attack from, let's say, a boss, but it does reduce a certain amount of damage each time, which is still very good. So you can cast this consecutively throughout the fight, and right before you think enemies are going to deal critical blows or attempt to. That way you can negate a lot of that damage if you fail. Life Wither is another good skill. This is going to be in the metal phase. You can cast this on enemies, especially right before you deal a fatal strike. So if they're down, you can cast this on an enemy, and it's going to make them receive more damage. That way your fatal strike will do more damage than it normally would. Venom Snare is a great ability. It releases a cursed bolt that when it hits enemies, it creates a fog around them and does damage to them over time. Certain enemies can withstand this damage, but a lot of enemies take a lot of poison damage from this. And with the build we have set up, they do increased toxin damage, meaning over time it can create a lot of damage on the enemy. The fourth skill is up to you, so it depends on the situation. So I use these skills half and half. I use Imposing Slab, which generates rocks in front of you, so that way it kind of puts some distance and damage between you and the enemy if they're going to come at you, or just fighting regular mobs in general. This is a great ability, and it scales with your rock damage, meaning it does a solid amount of damage. The other ability is Venomous Discharge, meaning you throw toxin at your enemy, it releases and explodes around them and does damage to them over time, as well as initial damage when it hits them. The first spell is Imposing Slab. This is your main damage ability for this build, meaning you can walk up, slam the ground, and this ability does high damage once the spikes come out of the ground, as well as it explodes and does additional damage to enemies. You can clear out a large amount of enemies in a group or singular, as well as bosses super easy. Around bosses, you can actually spam this ability. You can see I deflect an attack here. I use Imposing Slab once. Twice, the enemy is almost already dead. I then hit him with a fatal strike, and then you can use Imposing Slab again a third time when fighting bosses to take them out easy. The next ability is going to be Venom Snare. So this is going to create a cloud of gas around an enemy, following them around and doing damage over time, and a lot of it. So you can use this with other toxin abilities if you would like in this build, and you can basically always keep these debuffs and damage going on an enemy or bosses during a fight, which allows for a lot of passive damage, and that means less fatal strikes you have to hit to kill the boss. The next ability is going to be Life Wither. So Life Wither, I tested this. You can see a normal attack here doing 126, and then once I cast Life Wither, it does 184. That is a 25% at least damage increase, which is huge, especially for bosses. You can see I tested it here again, 170 for a normal attack. Hit them with Life Wither, and now it is up to about 211. That is huge, especially for bosses, and doing fatal strikes is a huge damage increase, at least like 20%. The final ability is going to be Illusionary Shell. It allows you to cast a spell on yourself and take a certain amount of damage and absorb that damage, almost canceling out a single attack at a time. This is great to cast before boss critical strikes to avoid damage. You won't avoid all the damage all the time, but it will take most of the damage for you. And finally here, I'm going to show you how to use these abilities and combo them best within boss fights and make boss fights literally super easy in this game. It is super fun to play. So obviously you're going to want to use your spear as your main weapon. Now you can use your poison ability to kind of get rid of enemies and smaller enemies around the map. If there's a bunch of enemies in a fight, you can cast your poison ability and it will hit almost all of them in a general area. You can use Imposing Slab against enemies as your main damage ability to basically take off a lot of their damage and give them a lot of spirit damage at the same time, which is great because you can cast this spell a lot of times in a row with this build currently. Again, you should always constantly apply your poison debuffs and damage to enemies, so that way over time they're taking a ton of damage. There's a lot of bosses you can almost kill entirely without even having to perform a fatal strike this way. As long as you keep them debuffed with poison and use Imposing Slab and have this build set up for heavy accumulation, you can see you can constantly apply 2 and 3 debuffs very easily to enemies, making them weaker to a lot of different things and allowing you to deal extra damage on top of the damage that you're already dealing. The more you use these abilities on enemies, the easier they're going to be to fight. You can see bosses here, you can walk up and use Imposing Slab on them very frequently, doing quite a lot of damage, while then being able to use your poison ability when you back up. Also, you can use Life Wither before fatal attacks to increase the massive amount of damage you already do into an insane amount of damage. It's really crazy. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe on this button that just popped up on the left and watch this awesome video on the right. And let me know your thoughts on this build in the comments below. That being said, thanks.